In mind, let's read the ancients. This passage comes from Astronomica, written by Manilius, and is a Latin didactic poem about celestial phenomena. The Ethiopians stain the world and depict a race of men steeped in darkness. Less sunburnt are the natives of India. The land of Egypt, flooded by the Nile, darkens bodies more mildly, owing to the inundation of its fields. It is a country nearer to us, and its moderate climate imparts a medium tone.
Metatron does not understand what he is reading, and I will demonstrate this fairly easy by reading the entire verse in which Astronomica describes the races of man. It starts by saying, for this reason, the human race is so arranged that its practices and features vary. Nations are fashioned with their own particular complexion, and each stamps with a character of its own. The like nature and anatomy of the human body, which all share. Germany, towering high with tall offspring, is blonde. Gaul is tinged to a less degree with a near related redness. Hardier Spain breeds close-knit sturdy limbs. The father of the city endows the Romans with the features of Mars, and Venus, joining the war god, fashions them with well-proportioned limbs, and quick-witted Greece proclaims in the tanned faces of its people the gymnasium, the manly wrestling schools. Curly hair about the temples betray the Syrians. The Ethiopians stain the world and depict a race of men steeped in darkness. Less sunburnt are the natives of India. The land of Egypt, flooded by the Nile, darkens bodies more mildly, owing to the inundation of its fields. It is a country nearer to us, and its moderate climate imparts a medium tone. The sun god dries up with dust the tribes of Africans amid their desert. The Moors derive their name from their faces and their identity proclaimed by the color of their skins. See, that is the entire verse that describes the Egyptians. But here's what I will show you. So if we look straight up to every time he describes a people, he says, this is the people that I'm describing. And he says, the race of men, the people of the. When it comes to Egypt, he does not describe the race of man. He describes the land. He says, as we read one more time, the Ethiopians stain the world and depict a race of men steeped in darkness. He specifically says the men are steeped in darkness. And then he says, less sunburned are the natives of India. Again, he's referring to people, human beings of India. Men, natives. These words are used for human beings. But when he comes to Egypt, he says, the land of Egypt, flooded by the Nile, darkens bodies more mildly, owing to the inundation of its fields. So over here, you cannot interpret this in another way except that he's talking about the land of Egypt flooded by the Nile. The land of Egypt, where it's flooded by the Nile. So there's a land that's Egypt, and it has the Nile on it. It's flooded by the Nile. Darkens bodies more mildly, owing to the inundation of its fields. So far, so good. The land is darkened mildly, and it owes to the fields. The fields is why, the mildness is why it has the fields, the inundation of its fields. It is a country nearer to us, and its moderate climate imparts a medium tone. Now, here is where I would say it's vague. its climate imparts a medium tone of what, the land or the people. But if you say that it's the people, a medium tone means nothing, especially if you compare what it said, less sunburnt are the natives of India, and then let's say it means and Egypt, as Metatron claims it means. Have you seen the people of India? Have you actually looked at them? Like you look at them straight in the face and you go, these are the people of India. You will lose yourself if you think that this comparison means that the Indians are not like black Africans.
Let's continue. From Arrianus between the 1st and 2nd century. The appearance of the inhabitants is also not very different in India and Ethiopia. The southern Indians are rather more like Ethiopians, as they are black to look on, and their hair is black, only they are not so snub-nosed or woolly-haired as the Ethiopians. The northern Indians are most like the Egyptians, physically. Unanimously? I'm not done.
Okay, so let us test this claim by checking the difference between dark-skinned Indians and light-skinned Indians, especially since he said the northern ones are different than the southern ones. Here's the big difference. This super white skin Indian thing, that is an exception, and it's usually due to migration from the Middle East, but it's not how most people would have seen the Indians back then. Do you really believe that the Indians, then they saw them, look like Arabs, or did they look like Indians?
Was there a point of time in your life when you thought that I need to bleach my skin or whiten my skin?
Yeah, I thought many times.
No, Indians were not supposed to be fairer. India receives more than 250 sunny days. So vitamin D is directly absorbed by skin, hence more melanin content, hence the darker skin.
From Strabo in its geography between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. As for the people of India, those in the south are like the Ethiopians in color, although they are like the rest in respect to countenance and hair, for on account of the humidity of the air, their hair does not curl, whereas those in the north are like the Egyptians.
The funny part about what Metatron just said is that it's so wrong that once I show you the evidence, all of you, I don't care how skeptical you are, will trust everything that I say. But let us back up one page so we can see exactly what they say. So also the Babylonians and the Egyptians are philosophers, not by nature, but by training and habit, and further the excellent qualities of horsemen, cattle, and other animals are the result not merely of locality, but the training also. But Poseidon confounds all this, and when he approves of such a division into 3 continents, as is now accepted, he uses as an illustration the fact that the Indians differ from the Ethiopians of Libya, for the Indians are better developed physically and less parched by the dryness of the atmosphere, and says he that is the reason why Homer, in speaking of the Ethiopians as a whole, divides them into 2 groups. Some were Hyperion sets and some were where he rises, but says Poseidonus creates introducing into the discussion the question of a second inhabited world, about which Homer knows nothing, is a slave to a hypothesis, and says Poseidon, the passage in Homer should have been amended to read, both were Hyperion departs, meaning he declines from the meridian. Now, in the first place, the Ethiopians that border on Egypt are themselves also divided into 2 groups, for some of them live in Asia, others in Libya, though they differ in no respect from each other, And in the second place, Homer divides the Ethiopians into two groups, not for this reason, namely because he knew that the Indians were physically similar to the Ethiopians. For Homer probably did not know of the Indians at all. If you don't understand what I just read, basically, Strabo is trying to indicate here that when Homer said Ethiopians, he meant all of the continent of Africa was Ethiopians, not part of it. And he declines a statement by Poseidonus, who claims that when he said that the Ethiopians were split in two, he was talking of Indians and Africans as the two split. But then he says clearly he does not state Asia as a second place of Ethiopians. So why doesn't he do this? In other words, Strabo is an Afrocentrist. And to put that in plainer words, Strabo, as you're going to see when I show you the next evidence, claims that the entire continent of Africa was owned by Ethiopians.
Which here perhaps may be considered out of place. Aristarchus we commend for rejecting the hypothesis of Crates, which is open to many objections, and for referring the expression of the poet to our Ethiopia. But the remainder of his statement we must discuss. First, his minute examination of the reading is altogether fruitless, for whichever way it may have been written, his interpretation is equally applicable to both. For what difference is there whether you say thus in our opinion there are two Ethiopias, one towards the east, the other to the west, or thus for they are as well towards the east as the west? Secondly, he makes false assumptions. For admitting that the poet was ignorant of the isthmus, and that he alludes to the Ethiopia contiguous to Egypt, when he says, the Ethiopians separated into two divisions. Odd. 23. What then? Are they not separated into two divisions? And could the poet have thus expressed himself if he had been in ignorance? Is not Egypt, nay, are not the Egyptians, separated into two divisions by the Nile from the delta to Syene, these towards the west, those towards the east? And what else is Egypt, with the exception of the island formed by the river and overflowed by its waters? Does it not lie on either side of the river both east and west? Ethiopia runs in the same direction as Egypt, and resembles it both in its position with respect to the Nile, and in its other geographical circumstances. It is narrow, long, and subject to inundation. Beyond the reach of this inundation it is desolate and parched, and unfitted for the habitation of man, some districts lying to the east and some to the west of the river. How then can we deny that it is separated into two divisions? Shall the Nile, which is looked upon by some people as the proper boundary line between Asia and Libya, and which extends southward in length more than 10,000 stadia, embracing in its breadth islands which contain populations of above 10,000 men, the largest of these being Meroe, the seat of empire and metropolis of the Ethiopians, be regarded as too insignificant to divide Ethiopia into two parts? The greatest obstacle which they who object to the river being made the line of demarcation between the two continents are able to allege, is, that Egypt and Ethiopia are by this means divided, one part of each being assigned to Libya, and the other to Asia, or, if this will not suit, the continents cannot be divided at all, or at least not by the river. 2.26 But besides these there is another method of dividing Ethiopia. All those who have sailed along the coasts of Libya, whether starting from the Arabian Gulf, or the Pillars, after proceeding a certain distance, have been obliged to turn back again on account of a variety of accidents, and thus originated a general belief that it was divided midway by some isthmus, although the whole of the Atlantic Ocean is confluent, more especially towards the south. Besides, all of these navigators called the final country which they reached, Ethiopia, and described it under that name. Is it therefore at all incredible, that Homer, misled by such reports, separated them into two divisions, one towards the east and the other west, not knowing whether there were any intermediate countries or not? But there is another ancient tradition related by Ephorus, which Homer had probably fallen in with. He tells us it is reported by the Tartessians, that some of the Ethiopians, on their arrival in Libya, penetrated into the extreme west, and settled down there, while the rest occupied the greater part of the seacoast, and in support of this statement he quotes the passage of Homer, the Ethiopians, the farthest removed of men, separated into two divisions. 2.27 These and other more stringent arguments may be urged against Aristarchus and those of his school, to clear our poet from the charge of such gross ignorance. I assert that the ancient Greeks, in the same way as they classed all the northern nations with which they were familiar under the one name of Scythians, or, according to Homer, Nemad, and afterwards becoming acquainted with those towards the west, styled them Celts and Iberians, sometimes compounding the names into Celtiberians, or Celtoscythians, thus ignorantly uniting various distinct nations. So I affirm they designated as Ethiopia the whole of the southern countries towards the ocean. Of this there is evidence, for Aeschylus, in the Prometheus Lust, thus speaks, there is the sacred wave, and the coralled bed of the Erythraean Sea, and, there, the luxuriant marsh of the Ethiopians, situated near the ocean, glitters like polished brass, where daily in the soft and tepid stream, the all-seeing sun bathes his undying self, and refreshes his weary steeds. And as the ocean holds the same position in respect to the sun, and serves the same purpose throughout the whole southern region, he therefore concludes that the Ethiopians inhabited the whole of the region. And Euripides in his Phaeton says that Clymene was given to Merops, sovereign of that land which from his four-horse chariot first the rising sun strikes with his golden rays, and which its swarthy neighbors call the radiant stable of the morn and sun. Here the poet merely describes them as the common stables of the morning and of the sun, but further on he tells us they were near to the dwellings of Merops, and in fact the whole plot of the piece has reference to this. This does not therefore refer alone to the land next to Egypt, but rather to the whole southern country extending along the seacoast. 2.28 Ephorus likewise shows us the opinion of the ancients respecting Ethiopia, in his treatise on Europe. He says, if the whole celestial and terrestrial globe were divided into 4 parts, the Indians would possess that towards the east, the Ethiopians towards the south, the Celts towards the west, and the Scythians towards the north. He adds that Ethiopia is larger than Scythia, for, says he, it appears that the country of the Ethiopians extends from the rising to the setting of the sun in winter, and Scythia is opposite to it. It is evident this was the opinion of Homer, since he places Ithaca towards the gloomy region, that is, towards the north, but the others apart, towards the morning and the sun, by which he means the whole southern hemisphere, and again when he says, speed they their course with right-hand flight towards the ruddy east, or leftward down into the shades of eve. Iliad 12. 239. And again, alas, my friends, for neither west know we, nor east, where rises or where sets the all-enlightening sun. Odd. X. 190, which we shall explain more fully when we come to speak of Ithaca. When therefore he says, for to the banks of the Oceanus, where Ethiopia holds a feast to Jove, he journeyed yesterday, Iliad I. 423. We should take this in a general sense, and understand by it the whole of the ocean which washes Ethiopia and the southern region, for to whatever part of this region you direct your attention, you will there find both the ocean and Ethiopia. It is in a similar style he says, but Neptune, traversing in his return from Ethiopia's sons the mountain heights of Sollum, descried him from afar. Odd. V. 282, which is equal to saying, in his return from the southern regions, meaning by the Solymi, as I remarked before, not those of Pisidia, but certain others merely imaginary, having the same name, and bearing the like relation to the navigators in Ulysses' ship, and the southern inhabitants there called Ethiopians, as those of Pisidia do in regard to Pontus and the inhabitants of Egyptian Ethiopia. What he says about the cranes must likewise be understood in a general sense. Such clang is heard along the skies, when from incessant showers escaping, and from winter's cold, the cranes take wing, and over ocean speed away. Woe to the land of dwarfs! Prepared they fly for slaughter of the small Pygmaean race. Iliad 3. 3. For it is not in Greece alone that the crane is observed to emigrate to more southern regions, but likewise from Italy and Iberia, from the shores of the Caspian, and from Bactriana. But since the ocean extends along the whole southern coast, and the cranes fly to all parts of it indiscriminately at the approach of winter, we must likewise believe that the Pygmies were equally considered to inhabit the whole of it. And if the moderns have confined the term of Ethiopians to those only who dwell near to Egypt, and have also restricted the Pygmies in like manner, this must not be allowed to interfere with the meaning of the ancients. We do not speak of all the people who fought against Troy as merely Achaeans and Argives, though Homer describes the whole under those 2 names. Similar to this is my remark concerning the separation of the Ethiopians into 2 divisions, that under that designation we should understand the whole of the nations inhabiting the seaboard from east to west. The Ethiopians taken in this sense are naturally separated into 2 parts by the Arabian Gulf, which occupies a considerable portion of a meridian circle, and resembles a river, being in length nearly 15,000 stadia, and in breadth not above 1,000 at the widest point. In addition to the length, the recess of the Gulf is distant from the sea at Pelusium only 3 or 4 days' journey across the isthmus. On this account, those who are most felicitous in their division of Asia and Africa prefer the Gulf as a better boundary line for the two continents than the Nile, since it extends almost entirely from sea to sea, whereas the Nile is so remote from the ocean that it does not by any means divide the whole of Asia from Africa. On this account, I believe it was the Gulf which the poet looked upon as dividing into two portions the whole southern regions of the inhabited earth. Is it possible, then, that he was unacquainted with the isthmus which separates this Gulf from the Egyptian Sea? 2.29 It is quite irrational to suppose that he could be accurately acquainted with Egyptian Thebes, which is separated from our sea by a little less than 5,000 stadia, and yet ignorant of the recess of the Arabian Gulf, and of the isthmus there, whose breadth is not more than 1,000 stadia. Still more, would it not be ridiculous to believe that Homer was aware the Nile was called by the same name as the vast country of Egypt, and yet unacquainted with the reason why? Especially since the saying of Herodotus would occur to him, that the country was a gift from the river, and it ought therefore to bear its name. Further, the best known peculiarities of a country are those which have something of the nature of a paradox, and are likely to arrest general attention. Of this kind are the rising of the Nile, and the alluvial deposition at its mouth. There is nothing in the whole country to which travelers in Egypt so immediately direct their inquiries, as the character of the Nile, nor do the inhabitants possess anything else equally wonderful and curious, of which to inform foreigners, for in fact, to give them a description of the river, is to lay open to their view every main characteristic of the country. It is the question put before every other by those who have never seen Egypt themselves. To these considerations we must add Homer's thirst after knowledge, and his delight in visiting foreign lands.
And there you have it. He divides Africa into Ethiopia as an entire continent rather than a small place under Egypt. And he then names 4 others as proof: Scythia, India, and Celtiberia, which is where the British are and the French and Spanish people are. And then he places himself firmly in the middle. That little piece you saw in the middle that I didn't highlight, that's where he puts himself. Now let's hear Metatron's other people that he brings up. Oh yeah, before we bring up Metatron, remember this. Strabo, who Metatron brought up as a debunk to Astronomica's claim that the Egyptians called all of the Africans Ethiopians, we just watched him spend 10 minutes debunking the claim that Metatron made. So keep that in mind about how bad the research Metatron did is.
Next one. Philostratus, nicknamed the Athenian, writes, "For when he arrived at the confines of Ethiopia and Egypt, and the name of the place is Sikaminus, he came across a quantity of uncoined gold and linen. It was a marketplace to which the Ethiopians bring all the products of their country, and the Egyptians in their turn take them all away and bring to the same spot their own wares of equal value. Now the inhabitants of the marches being the bordering land between Egypt and Nubia, for context, are not yet fully black, but are half-breeds in matter of color. For they are partly not so black as the Ethiopians, yet partly more so than the Egyptians." So, according to an ancient Greek, the Egyptians are the light-skinned, the Ethiopians are the black-skinned, and these inhabitants of the marches are in between. Unanimously?
Now, as you can see, I've got the same page that Metatron says what he says, but let us read what it actually says. "Now as they descended the mountain, they say they came in for a dragon hunt, which I must needs describe, for it is utterly absurd for those who are amateurs of hare hunting to spin yarns about the hare as to how it is caught or ought to be caught, and yet that we should omit to describe a chase as bold as it is wonderful, and in which the sage was careful to assist. So I have written the following account of it. The whole of India is girt with dragons of enormous size, for not only the marshes are full of them, but the mountains as well, and there is not a single ridge without one. Now the marsh kind are sluggish in their habits and are 30 cubits long, and they have no crest standing up on their heads, but in this respect resembles the she dragons. Their backs, however, are very black, with fewer scales on them than the other kinds, and Homer has described them with deeper insight than have most poets, for he says that the dragon that lived hard by spring in Allius had a tawny back, but other poets declared that the cognomer of this one in the grove Nemea also had crest, a feature which we could not verify in regard to the marsh dragons. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like it has anything to do with Ethiopia. But I will say that I will help Metatron out because I think I know the verse that he speaks of. Okay, so this is a different page of the same book that Metatron just gave that I read. Now, listen carefully. There was then, he said, a time when the Ethiopians, an Indian race, dwelt in this country, and when Ethiopia as yet was not, but Egypt stretched its border beyond Meroe and the cataracts, and on the one side included it in itself the fountain of the Nile, and on the other was only bounded by the months of the river. Well, at the time of which I speak, the Ethiopians lived here and were subject to King Ganges, and the land was sufficient for their sustenance, and the gods watched over them. But when they slew this king, neither did the rest of the Indians regard them as pure, nor did the land permit them to remain upon it. So as you can see, this guy, Philostratus, claims that he talked to somebody, and this person said that the Ethiopians are actually an Indian race and they used to live in India, but they were exiled because their people killed someone, King Ganges. Generally, this story is considered complete fiction. And again, we have to dismiss this evidence as shoddy at best, since we see that he says something that Metatron didn't say, and he claims that Ethiopians are Indians instead of claiming that they're not. In fact, in this one, he claims that they come from the same region.
I'm not done.
Yes, you are done. The information you gave was shoddy. Everything you said turned out to not be exactly as you said it was, and the evidences were just not convincing at all. I would say you're very done. The next thing that he shows is some flimsy evidence about Athena turning some guy's skin black, and then he argues that it's not them turning him into a Ethiopian man, but instead turning him youthful, which, by the way, once you evoke magic, all bets are off. He could turn someone Ethiopian. She could turn someone Ethiopian if she wanted to. So I'm not going to address this point at all. Anyway, you should subscribe because this took a long time to do. God damn.